Hi everyone, it's good to see you. We are going to be covering weathering, erosion, and deposition through this video. This is the information you'll need to have in order to do the lab. There will be a second video that explains the lab. As you go through these, there's going to be some information that is in blue text. And when you see the blue text, that's your cue to pause the video if you need to and copy that down either in your online Google document, if that's where you're taking notes, or to write it down on a piece of paper if you prefer to take your notes that way. If you printed them, you can either send me a picture of the notes that you took on your piece of paper, or you can drop it off in the folder that's by my door or taped to the outside of the classroom door. So weathering, erosion, and deposition. As you can see up here, weathering happens up in the mountains. Erosion carries the sediment or the rock particles down from the mountain, and deposition is where it ends up. Now, the reason we're going over this after mountain building is because plate tectonics caused all those mountains to build up really high. The weathering, erosion, deposition is what causes our mountains as they get older to break down and even disappear. And this is one of the reasons why the White Mountains on the east side of town look a lot lower and smoother and more rounded than the Sierras, because the White Mountains are older and so they've had more time for erosion. So one of the key ideas is the movement of tectonic plates makes these mountains. The weathering, erosion, and deposition cuts these mountains down. If any of you recognize this photo, this is the Grand Canyon. And this is where we've had mostly water, some wind, break down particles in the rock and carry them away, creating a deeper and deeper canyon as time moves on. So this is the Colorado River that's eroding the sediment to make this canyon. So our vocabulary. There are 4 vocabulary words you need to know. First is weathering. Weathering just breaks rock into tiny pieces. It doesn't go anywhere. So weathering is if you took a hammer and you smash the rock, that's breaking it into pieces. Erosion is what transports the pieces. So this is where the rock is actually moving through a river or when sand gets blown in the wind. Deposition is when the sediment lays down in a low area. It usually gets dropped in a river, in a basin, in the ocean. And when we're talking about sediment, sediment can be any little rock pieces like clay, sand, or something bigger like a boulder. So there are 2 parts to weathering. The first is mechanical weathering, and the second is chemical weathering. And weathering can be either one of these. So first, we have mechanical weathering, which breaks rock into smaller pieces, but the mineral stays the same. It's really important. So in mechanical weathering, it's like you're taking a hammer and smashing it up, but you still have the same type of rock when you're done. It's just in small pieces. Chemical weathering changes the minerals from one type of mineral to another type of mineral. So in this example, we have a statue that had chemical weathering, and the calcium carbonate that the statue is made of got dissolved by acid in the rain, and it changed into calcium. So the first step in weathering is to break the rock up and create cracks. There are a couple ways this can be done. One is that you can have stress that squeezes the rock up to break it. This is, imagine you put rock in a vice grip and you press and you press and you press on it until the stress breaks the rock. The other option is the opposite. So this is called exfoliation. If you know that sometimes people use exfoliation when they rub skin off. And it's the same idea with the rock. So instead of the stress pressing on the rock to make it more compressed, the stress actually is removed from the rock. And as the stress is removed from the rock expands and breaks. We see this in Yosemite. Remember how last week we learned about how Yosemite and the Sierra Nevada are formed by this lava that actually stayed underground. It was this magma that hardened in the batholith underground, and then later with erosion, it came up and emerged as our mountains. What happened is underground, there's a lot of stress holding all this rock together. As the rock comes up above ground, it releases the pressure and it makes the granite crack and peel like an onion. And you can see this on a lot of the domes, especially if you go to Tuolumne. You'll see these cracks, and it looks like the rock's outer layers of skin are sloughing off, and that's exactly what's happening. The second type of, the most important agent of weathering takes over, and what do you think that agent is? So go ahead and look at these pictures. What is making these rocks break apart? Pause the video if you need to think about it. And the answer is water. The main agent that causes weathering, breaking up of rock, is water. Now what happens here is water gets in this crack, so you can see the water poured in, and then it freezes and becomes ice. And ice takes up more room than just water. So ice expands and it breaks the rock apart. And then this process, as it presses the rock apart, it's called ice wedging. So you can see where the ice filled in this area, it pressed the rock apart, and now the rock is broken into a smaller piece. There are other cracks right here and here in the rock, and those cracks will probably also eventually fill with water in the summer. Then as the winter comes, it freezes, it breaks the rock apart, and the rock keeps getting broken into smaller pieces. So water can cause both mechanical weathering, like ice wedging, which we covered, and chemical weathering, which are going to be oxidation and dissolution. Remember, chemical weathering is where we said that the mineral actually changes. So the first one is oxidation. Oxidation sounds like oxygen, doesn't it? It's rocks with ferromagnesium minerals, and it's when they interact with oxygen. So what happens is it's just like what happened to this nail right here. This nail had ferromagnesium. So remember, ferro is iron, and magnesium, or the magnetism, comes from magnesium. This rock with the iron in it, the iron plus the oxygen together, that forms rust. And you can see this nail has rusted over time. That's called oxidation. If you look down at this picture of the rock, do you see how it changed the same color, that red? The rock also rusts over time, just like a nail. So when you see rock that was light gray and it's turning into more of an orange or reddish color, you know that rock used to have iron. The iron interacted with the oxygen and it began to rust. The other type of chemical weathering we'll go over is called dissolution. So dissolution is when water dissolves the minerals, allowing the ions to recombine to new minerals. Remember, chemical weathering is where it has to change from one type of mineral to another type of mineral. So in this top picture right here, we have water that dissolves the salt. So you can see the salt breaking up into little ions from the water. Ion is just a word for a small charged particle. In the second picture, you can see where the water dissolved the rock and it pulled some of the rock off and left part behind. This is called a honeycomb pattern, and you can actually see this north of Bishop when you go to the volcanic tablelands. You'll see these scoops in the rock where the water came in and did dissolution because it dissolved the minerals in the rock and washed away some of them and left different minerals behind. Now there's two products of weathering that you're going to see, especially when you do your lab. Three products. The first one is quartz, and quartz is really hard. It doesn't react chemically, but it can be broken into smaller pieces of quartz if enough force hits on it. So think about this. When we break something into smaller pieces, is this mechanical or is this chemical? Pause the video if you need to. It's mechanical weathering. So this is going to be mechanical weathering. Another type of product we see from weathering is called feldspars. And these feldspars change from feldspar to a clay mineral. The chemical reaction is plagioclase plus carbonic acid turns into kaolinite, dissolved calcium, and carbonate ions. So right here you see this was the rock before the weathering happened, and this is the rock after. One hint is look for the color change. What kind of weathering is this? Do you think it's mechanical or chemical? Yes, this is chemical weathering. One of the tips you have is this chemical reaction, right? When the minerals change from one type to another, you have chemical weathering. But the other indication you have that it's chemical weathering is when you see a color change from one to the other, that's a hint that a chemical reaction took place. Last product of weathering that you will see in our lab is ferromagnesium can turn into clay and iron oxides. So this is the other thing it can turn into. What type of weathering do you think that this would be? Now notice, this is what it looked like before on the inside of the rock, and this is what the outside of the rock looks like afterwards. Yes, this would be chemical weathering because we see that color change. Before it was light colored and afterwards it was kind of orange colored. So this chemical weathering was the oxidation with the rocks with the ferromagnesium minerals. Remember, ferro is iron, magnesium is magnesium, and iron plus oxygen forms rust. So that was all going over weathering, how rocks are broken down either by mechanical or chemical means. The next part of our notes is erosion. And think about looking at these pictures, what do you think the most important agent of erosion is? Remember, erosion is carrying away sediment, washing it down. So the most important agent is going to be water. As you can see, water was powerful enough. This is more after some chemical weathering, but water pulled all the sand out of this valley. Water also was powerful enough to wash away part of this road. Now, there's three ways the sediment can be transported, and it's kind of by size. So the smallest size is up here in the blue part of the water. It's so small we don't even see the dots. This is called dissolved load. And these are tiny charged particles that are dissolved in water. Think about when you take salt and you can mix it in water and you can stir it and stir it and stir it and stir it until you can't even see the salt anymore. And if you wanted to play an April Fool's joke on someone, you could offer them this salt water because they wouldn't be able to tell it was salt water until they tasted it. So this is the dissolved load, where things are so dissolved you can't see it until you maybe taste it. The second level is suspended load. These are smaller pieces that are carried in the water. Now, you can see them because they turn the water kind of brown. See these little brown specks right here? And then the third one is bed load. These are bigger pieces that are pushed along the bottom of the river. These are the rocks, the gravel. They're not actually lifted up into the water, but they're pushed and tumbled along the bottom of the river. So there's the three types. The bed load on the bottom. You can see this river is moving really fast and it's able to carry some of the big boulders. The suspended load in here where you can see the particles and you can tell that there's suspended load in there because they turn the river this murky brown. And then dissolved load, which are ions that make like salt that dissolve in the water that are kind of clear. Now, the way the sediment is transported depends on both the size of the sediment and it depends on the speed of the water. We're going to talk about that in a second. So we covered weathering, where rocks get broken down, erosion, where rocks get moved. The last one is deposition. So deposition, remember, is where it lays down sediment in low areas. So this is where they get deposited or dropped from the water. So what minerals are we going to talk about being deposited? Quartz and clay. So the way things get deposited is as the water slows down, the water loses energy, and then it deposits more and more particles. This is a really important idea. So this part is one to really pay attention to and use when you do your lab. The largest particle that water can transport depends on the speed of the water. So looking at this picture, this is a picture of the Potomac, a river on the East Coast, and it's fast water, it has lots of energy, and you notice here it can transport really large rocks, pretty big boulders, as well as anything smaller than that. This would be what our rivers look like up in the mountains in the Sierras. You've seen the waterfalls. You've probably even heard some of the rocks tumbling around. That's because this fast water has lots of energy and can transport large rocks. The next idea is that slower water has less energy and can only transport clay-sized particles and dissolved loads. So this river here is moving and it can move clay and small particles, but it's not going to be strong enough or have enough energy to move boulders. So deposition, there's three parts. The faster the water, the big boulders are deposited, but it moves everything else. So maybe the rock isn't going to move the hugest of these boulders, but it can move really big ones. Medium speed water, this is showing Bishop Creek going through town. This creek is moving fast enough to move gravel, silt, a little bit, but mostly it's going to drop those. And when you look in the water, you'll see that it's only really moving the clay and the ions. And then the last, once the water slows down and stops moving, like when it reaches the reservoir, some of the salt, the ions that are dissolved in there will drop. Some will be actually carried on to the ocean. So one final thing to think about is, why is the ocean salty? It's because those clays and the dissolved ions have salt, and some of them are actually carried by our rivers all the way down to the ocean. If the ions are dissolved enough in the water, that salt can actually go from the mountains around Bishop all the way to the ocean, and that's what makes it salty. Thanks for watching. Please double check that your notes are all filled in. You can go back through this video or you can look through the slides online for anything you might have missed. Feel free to email or text me questions. When you are done, go ahead and take a look at the lab.